Consider the following list. Michael Mukasey, recently appointed as U.S. Attorney General. Mukasey also was the judge in the litigation between developer Larry Silverstein and several insurance companies arising from the destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11/2001. Michael Chertoff, former Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division at the Justice Department, now head of Homeland Security. Richard Perle, one of Bush's foreign policy advisors. He is the chairman of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. A very likely Israeli government agent, Perle was expelled from Senator Henry Jackson's office in the 1970s after the National Security Agency, or NSA, caught him passing highly classified national security documents to the Israeli embassy. He later worked for the Israeli weapons firm Soltam. Perle came from a pro-Israel think tank, the AEI. Perle is one of the leading pro-Israeli fanatics leading this Iraq warmongering within the administration and now in the media. Paul Wolfowitz, former Deputy Defense Secretary and member of Perle's Defense Policy Board in the Pentagon. Wolfowitz is a close associate of Perle and reportedly has close ties to the Israeli military. His sister lives in Israel. Wolfowitz came from the Jewish think tank Gensa. Wolfowitz was the number 2 leader within the administration behind this Iraq warmongering. He later was appointed head of the World Bank, but resigned under pressure from World Bank members over a scandal involving his misuse of power. Lawrence or Larry Franklin, the former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst with expertise in Iranian policy issues, who worked in the Office of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith and reported directly to Fife's deputy William Lutey, was sentenced 20th January 2006 to, quote, more than 12 years in prison for giving classified information to an Israeli diplomat, unquote. And members of the pro-Israel lobbying group American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. Franklin will, quote, remain free while the government continues with the wider case, unquote. And his, quote, prison time could be sharply reduced in return for his help in prosecuting, unquote, former AIPAC members Stephen J. Rosen and Keith Weissman. As an update to this, the trial with these AIPAC spies has been postponed indefinitely. How could the trial be postponed indefinitely? Kevin DeGregory was the head prosecuting attorney, but weeks prior to the trial, he had retired from his position as prosecutor to go work for a Jewish law firm. Douglas Feith, Undersecretary of Defense and Policy Advisor at the Pentagon. He is a close associate of Perle and served as his special counsel. Like Perle and the others, Feith is a pro-Israel extremist who has advocated anti-Arab policies in the past. He is closely associated with the extremist group the Zionist Organization of America, which even attacks Jews that don't agree with its extremist views. Feith frequently speaks at ZOA conferences. Feith runs a small law firm, Feith & Zell, which only has one international office in Israel. The majority of their legal work is representing Israeli interests. His firm's own website stated prior to his appointment that Feith, quote, represents Israeli armaments manufacturer, unquote. Feith basically represents the Israeli war machine. Feith also came from the Jewish think tank Gensa. Feith, like Perle and Wolfowitz, are campaigning hard for the continuation of the Israeli proxy wars against Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan. Feith was investigated by the FBI under suspicion of leaking classified information to Israel, being that he was Larry Franklin's boss when Franklin leaked those documents to Rosen and Weissman of AIPAC. For that, he was forced to leave the National Security Council. Feith was also investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee for sexing up intelligence that was used to justify invading Iraq. Edward Lutwick, member of the National Security Study Group of the Department of Defense at the Pentagon, Lutwick is reportedly an Israeli citizen and has taught in Israel. He frequently writes for Israeli and pro-Israeli newspapers and journals. Lutwick is an Israeli extremist whose main theme in many of his articles is the necessity of the U.S. waging war against Iraq and Iran. Henry Kissinger, one of the many Pentagon advisors, Kissinger sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Perle. For detailed information about Kissinger's evil past, read Seymour Hersh's book, Price of Power. Kissinger in the Nixon White House. Kissinger likely had a part in the Watergate crimes, Southeast Asia mass murders, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, installing Chilean mass murdering dictator Pinochet, Operation Condor's mass killings in South America, and more recently served as Serbia's ex-dictator Slobodan Milosevic's advisor. He consistently advocated going to war against Iraq. Kissinger is the Ariel Sharon of the U.S. Unfortunately, President Bush nominated Kissinger as chairman of the September 11th Investigating Commission. It's like picking a bank robber to investigate a fraud scandal. He later declined this job under enormous protests. Dov Zakheim. Dov Zakheim is an ordained rabbi and reportedly holds Israeli citizenship. Zakheim attended Jews College in London and became an ordained Orthodox Jewish rabbi in 1973. He was adjunct professor at New York's Jewish Yeshiva University. Zakheim is close to the Israeli lobby. Dov Zakheim is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR, and in 2000 a co-author of the project for the New American Century's position paper titled Rebuilding America's Defenses, advocating the necessity for a Pearl Harbor-like incident to mobilize the country into war with Israel's enemies, mostly Middle Eastern Muslim nations. He was appointed by Bush as Pentagon Comptroller from 4th May 2001 to 10th March 2004. At that time, he was unable to explain the disappearance of $1 trillion. Actually, nearly 3 years earlier, Donald Rumsfeld announced on 10th September 2001 that an audit discovered $2.3 trillion was also missing from the Pentagon books. That story, as mentioned, was buried under 9/11's rubble. The two sums disappeared under Zakheim's watch. Despite these suspicions, on 6th May 2004, Zakheim took a lucrative position at Bose Allen Hamilton, one of the most prestigious strategy consulting firms in the world. One of its clients then was Blessed Relief, a charity said to be a front for Osama bin Laden. Bose Allen and Hamilton then also worked closely with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is the research arm of the Department of Defense. Intelligence concerning Dov tells us that he is a dual Israeli-American citizen and has been tracking the halls of the U.S. government for 25 years, casting defense policy and influence on Presidents Reagan, Clinton, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr. Further intelligence points out that most of Israel's armaments were gotten thanks to him. Squads of U.S. F-16s and F-15s were classified as military surplus and sold to Israel at a fraction of their value. Kenneth Edelman, one of the many Pentagon advisors, Edelman also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Edelman frequently is a guest on Fox News and often expresses extremist and often ridiculous anti-Arab and anti-Muslim views. Through his racism or ignorance, he actually called Arabs anti-Semitic on Fox News, dated 28 November 2001, when he could have looked it up in the dictionary to find out that Arabs, by definition, are Semitic people. They are Semites. Louis Scooter Libby, Vice President Dick Cheney's ex-chief of staff, as chief pro-Israel Jewish advisor to Cheney, it helps explain why Cheney is so gung-ho to invade Iran. Libby is longtime associate of Wolfowitz. Libby was also a lawyer for convicted felon and Israeli spy Mark Rich, whom Clinton pardoned in his last days as president. Libby was recently found guilty of lying to federal investigators in the Valerie Plame affair, in which Plame, a covert CIA agent, was exposed for political revenge by the Bush administration following her husband's revelations about the lies leading to the Iraq War. Robert Satloff, U.S. National Security Council advisor, Satloff was the executive director of the Israeli lobby's think tank, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Many of the Israeli lobby's experts come from this front group, like Martin Indyk. Elliot Abrams, National Security Council advisor, he previously worked at Washington-based Middle-based think tank Ethics and Public Policy Center. During the Reagan administration, Abrams was the Assistant Secretary of State, handling, for the most part, Latin American affairs. Played an important role in the Iran-Contra scandal, which involved illegally selling U.S. weapons to Iran to fight Iraq, and illegally funding the Contra rebels fighting to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinista government. He also actively deceived 3 congressional committees about his involvement and thereby faced felony charges based on his testimony. Abrams pled guilty in 1991 to 2 misdemeanors and was sentenced to a year's probation and 100 hours of community service. A year later, former President Bush, Sr., granted Abrams a full pardon. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the Reagan administration's State Department. Mark Grossman, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. He was Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Human Resources at the Department of State. Grossman is one of many of the pro-Israel Jewish officials from the Clinton administration that Bush has promoted to higher posts. Richard Haass, Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and Ambassador at Large. He is also Director of National Security Programs and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, or CFR. He was one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the first Bush Sr. administration who sat on the National Security Council and who consistently advocated going to war against Iraq. Haass is also a member of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. Robert Zoellick, U.S. Trade Representative, a cabinet-level position. He is also one of the more hawkish pro-Israel Jews in the Bush Jr. administration who advocated invading Iraq and occupying a portion of the country in order to set up a Vichy-style puppet government. He consistently advocates going to war against Iran. Ari Fleischer, ex-White House spokesman for the Bush Jr. administration, prominent in the Jewish community. Some reports state that he holds Israeli citizenship. Fleischer is closely connected to the extremist Jewish group called the Chabad Lubavitch Hasidics, who follow the Kabbalah and hold very extremist and insulting views of non-Jews. Fleischer was the co-president of the Chabad's Capital Jewish Forum. He received the Young Leadership Award from the American Friends of Lubavitch in October 2001. James Celsinger, one of many Pentagon advisors, Celsinger also sits on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor who supported going to war against Iraq. Celsinger is also a commissioner of the Defense Department's National Security Study Group at the Pentagon. David Frum, White House speechwriter behind the Axis of Evil label. He lumped together all the lies and accusations against Iraq for Bush to justify the war. Joshua Bolten, White House Deputy Chief of Staff. Bolten was previously a banker, former legislative aide, and prominent in the Jewish community. John Bolton, former UN representative and Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Bolton is also a senior advisor to President Bush. Prior to this position, Bolton was senior vice president of the above-mentioned pro-Israel think tank, AEI. He recently, October 2002, accused Syria of having a nuclear program so that they can attack Syria after Iraq or Iran. He must have forgotten that Israel has several hundred nuclear warheads, some of which are thermonuclear weapons, according to recent intelligence from the United States Air Force. David Wormser, special assistant to John Bolton, the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. Wormser also worked at the AEI with Pearl and Bolton. His wife, Merav Wormser, along with Colonel Yigal Carmen, formerly of Israeli Military Intelligence, co-founded the Middle East Media Research Institute, or MEMRI, a Washington-based Israeli outfit which distributes articles translated from Arabic newspapers portraying Arabs in a bad light. Elliot Cohen, member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board under Pearl, and is another extremist pro-Israel advisor. Like Edelman, he often expresses extremist and often ridiculous anti-Arab and anti-Muslim views. More recently, he wrote an opinion article in the Wall Street Journal openly admitting his racist hatred of Islam, claiming that Islam should be the enemy, not terrorism.
Look, sometimes the word neoconservative is used when what they really would like to say is Jew. They being people who use that kind of language. And as a Jew, I find it offensive. There are two things that are despicable about it. The first is the imputation of dual loyalties. What they really would like to say is Jew.
Mel Sembler, president of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, a prominent Jewish Republican and former national finance chairman of the Republican National Committee. The Export-Import Bank facilitates trade relationships between U.S. businesses and foreign countries, specifically those with financial problems. Steve Goldsmith, senior advisor to the president and Bush's Jewish domestic policy advisor. He also served as liaison in the White House office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, White House OFBCI, within the Executive Office of the President. He was the former mayor of Indianapolis. He is also friends with Israeli Jerusalem Mayor Ehud Olmert and often visits Israel to coach mayors on privatization initiatives. A number of other dual Israeli citizens serving in our government are Adam Goldman, White House's special liaison to the Jewish community, Joseph Gildenhorn, Bush campaign's special liaison to the Jewish community. He was the D.C. finance chairman for the Bush campaign, as well as campaign coordinator and former ambassador to Switzerland. Christopher Gersten, principal deputy assistant secretary, administration for children and families at HHS. Gersten was the former executive director of the Republican Jewish Coalition, husband of labor secretary. Mark Weinberger, assistant secretary of housing and urban development for public affairs. Samuel Bodman, Deputy Secretary of Commerce. He was the chairman and CEO of Cabot Corporation in Boston, Massachusetts. Bonnie Cohen, Undersecretary of State for Management. Ruth Davis, Director of Foreign Service Institute, who reports to the Office of Undersecretary for Management. This office is responsible for training all Department of State staff, including ambassadors. Daniel Kurtzer, Ambassador to Israel. Cliff Sobel, Ambassador to the Netherlands. Stuart Bernstein, Ambassador to Denmark. Nancy Brinker, Ambassador to Hungary. Frank Lavin, Ambassador to Singapore. Ron Weiser, Ambassador to Slovakia. Mel Sembler, Ambassador to Italy, mentioned earlier. Martin Silverstein, Ambassador to Uruguay. Lincoln Bloomfield, Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. Jay Lefkowitz, Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of the Domestic Policy Council. Ken Millman, White House Political Director, and Brad Blakeman, White House Director of Scheduling.
Michael Chertoff is now the Director of Homeland Security. Prior to his appointment as Director, he oversaw the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice till July of 2001. He is the man behind the investigation of 9/11, or lack of investigation, as it were. Chertoff was the U.S. prosecuting attorney for the District of New Jersey. Michael Chertoff is the person who had control of the evidence and prosecution of the first bombing of the World Trade Center. Chertoff's father is a man by the name of Gershon Baruch Chertoff, who happens to be a Talmudic rabbi. Michael Chertoff's uncle Mordecai is also a rabbi. Michael's grandfather was a very well-known teacher of the Talmud in New York City. Chertoff's sister was the head of Hadassah, the women's branch of the Zionist Organization of America. She went to a Hebrew university before Israel was even a state. The Chertoff family was one of the founding families of the State of Israel. Michael Chertoff's aunt works with the Zionist movement in London, Chicago, and New York City. Chertoff's power over domestic security is enormous at this point. He is the head boss of departments like the TSA, or Transportation Security Administration, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, U.S. Immigration, U.S. Secret Service, FEMA, and the corresponding detention camps ran by FEMA, U.S. Coast Guard, federal law enforcement, training centers, domestic nuclear detection Office, National Cybersecurity Center, to name a few. Chertoff has direct access to the Department of Justice and the FBI because he has many Jewish cohorts in strategic positions throughout these departments. It has been a guarded secret for quite some time that Michael Chertoff was the author of the Patriot Act, a bill edited by Via Din that effectively nullifies the Constitution of the United States of America and the Bill of Rights. It was originally common knowledge that Ashcroft was the author of the so-called Patriot Act, but it was Chertoff who engineered this traitorous bill. It should also be noted that Chertoff has direct access to every single police and sheriff department in the country because since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, they have appointed people in every police department to have a liaison for the DHS. This dual citizen of Israel, with obvious loyalties not to the United States, will be in direct control of events as they happen if martial law is ever declared on Americans.
We must go forward in our timeline to the year 2007 to understand this next piece of telling but peculiar evidence. It is necessary to understand how the Jewish crime network continues to function undetected by the average person. Their operatives and Sionim informants and assistants must play all sides and every side to retain the illusion that they aren't working on the same side. They play friend and associate, entertainer, business partner, villain, and hero. If we examine the tragic events of the Virginia Tech shooting, we find Cho Seung-Kyu shooting two individuals at 7:15 a.m. This was reported to the authorities as gunfire and one person dead on the scene. 2 hours went by before Cho opened fire on several dozen persons at the campus's Norris Hall. Why didn't the school president warn the students and suspend classes? The school president is none other than Charles Steger, a Jew. Steger was silent for approximately 2 hours. This is reminiscent of the Audigo employees who received a warning about the 9/11 attacks, but apparently decided not to save non-Jewish lives by sharing that information with others. 2 students reported that they could have been able to put Cho down with their firearms, but recent restrictions to carrying guns to school passed by Steger disarmed them, allowing Cho to safely gun down students with neither a warning to them nor the ability of brave men to handle the situation with legally owned firearms. If you examine the gun control laws of the past 100 years, you will find members of the Jewish crime network putting such laws in place. It is a fact that restriction of firearms means a higher crime rate, but that is a subject for another video. All this eventually returns to the subject of 9/11 by way of Virginia Tech professor Liviu Librescu. At age 76 and approximately 145 pounds soaking wet, he was supposedly able to hold off Cho and reportedly then saved the lives of several students. So our hero of the day, despite the obvious finger pointing at the Jewish crime network via school president Charles Steger, is none other than Jewish Librescu. So who is one of the key heroes of the day on 9/11? Despite mounting evidence demonstrated herein that the attacks were orchestrated by Jews and their non-Jewish criminal cohorts, we find that the hero of Flight 93 is none other than Jeremy Glick, a Jew. Supposedly, Glick was the brave soul that motivated people on board Flight 93 to overtake the supposed hijackers and crash the plane into the ground in Pennsylvania to keep it from hitting its intended target. Of course, eyewitness reports, insiders, video and photographic evidence seem to show that Flight 93 was shot down and didn't actually crash land. But like the gun control issue, that's another topic for another video. So of the supposedly 3 Jews that died on 9/11, one miraculously turns out to be a hero of the day, along with the Jewish hero of Virginia Tech, of course. Quite a mathematical absurdity. The appointed federal judges Alvin K. Hellerstein and Michael B. Mukasey, and the former Assistant Attorney General Michael Chertoff, who now heads Homeland Security, have worked for almost 7 years to hide critical evidence and block discovery of important details concerning the orchestrators of the 9/11 attack. Immediately after the horrific events of 9/11, while the country was mourning, grieving, and beginning to feel vengeful toward the supposedly official culprits, the key players involved in 9/11 were maneuvering in unison behind the scenes to cover all angles of investigation and began building up their damage control infrastructure. The Kenneth Feinberg Group is listed as one of the top 10 supporters of the Jerusalem Institute for Israel Studies for 2004 and 2005. The Jerusalem Institute is an Israel-based Zionist organization that supports the building of the illegal separation wall across Palestine, for example. The Feinberg Group also lists as its clients major insurance and reinsurance companies such as Lloyd's of London. These are the companies who stood to lose billions of dollars if 9/11 victims' lawsuits had gone forward. Feinberg was appointed special master by then Attorney General John Ashcroft. Ashcroft, a dedicated supporter of the Jewish criminal mafia and supporter of such groups as Stand for Israel, is today working as a lobbyist for Israel Aerospace Industries, or IAI, Israel's major military aerospace company, which hired the former U.S. Attorney General to help secure the U.S. government's approval to sell an Israeli weapons system to the South Korean Air Force. Kenneth Feinberg set up the Victims' Compensation Fund. This was a treasure chest of some $7 billion in taxpayer money that would be forked out to the victims of the Israeli 9/11 attack. Since undoubtedly many families lost their primary breadwinner on 9/11, they had a choice between a sizable payout or a long drawn-out investigation with little to no guarantee of success if they chose to pursue legal action against the airlines and the passenger screening security companies. Thus, 97% of eligible victims' families waive their rights to litigate against the government, the airlines, and the security companies responsible for passenger screening at the airports. This prevented any discoveries that could be made via legal battle in the courts for nearly every relative of a victim of 9/11. However, our so-called Israeli allies who masterminded 9/11 weren't satisfied with a 97% cover-up. Enter two very dedicated criminal Jews with close ties to the Israeli crime network and judges who very conveniently belong to the same synagogue. Judge Alvin Hellerstein and our new Attorney General, Michael Mukasey. A little background on Hellerstein is necessary here. Judge Hellerstein has a deep and long-standing connection to the Jewish criminal network and close family ties to the State of Israel. Judge Hellerstein's wife is a former senior vice president and current treasurer of a New York-based Jewish organization called AMIT. AMIT promotes Jewish immigration to Israel and stands for Americans for Israel and Torah. AMIT's motto is Building Israel, One Child at a Time. Judge Hellerstein, age 73, is also a longtime member of the Jewish Center of New York and a former president of the Board of Jewish Education of Greater New York. This raises the obvious question about why, in the 9/11 terror case in which an Israeli security company is a key defendant and in which individuals from Israeli military intelligence are suspected of being involved, was Hellerstein chosen to preside over all 9/11 victim lawsuits? And who chose him? Judge Alvin Hellerstein has stated, quote, "There is an extraordinary public benefit in having these cases resolved and not allowing through them the wounds of 9/11 suffered by our entire society to keep festering." Hellerstein's mission was to quickly resolve the cases. The rush to case resolution was to eliminate all threats of legal investigations by means of more payouts. To this hour, not a single plaintiff's day in court to present evidence in a trial has come to fruition. The more persistent and uncooperative plaintiffs have dealt with the special mediator of Hellerstein's court, Sheila Birnbaum, another key Jew. Sheila Birnbaum, the special mediator, is a partner in the law firm of Skadden Arps, a leading corporate law firm with close business ties to Israel. The firm calls itself, quote, one of the leading U.S. legal advisors to Israeli companies doing business and raising capital outside of Israel. The firm's website proclaims, many of our attorneys are thoroughly familiar with the legal structure, business environment, and political system of Israel, and several have been admitted to the bars of both Israel and New York, and are fluent in Hebrew and English, unquote. Israeli individuals and companies, however, are suspects and defendants in the crimes of 9/11. At least 200 Israeli suspects were arrested in connection with 9/11. Certainly, these salient facts cannot be mere random coincidence. The key individuals who arranged the privatization and obtained control of the 10.6 million square foot complex known as the World Trade Center shortly before its destruction are Larry Silverstein, former Israeli commando and Westfield shopping mall tycoon Frank Lowy, and Port Authority Chairman Louis M. Eisenberg, who authorized the transfer of the leases. Silverstein, Lowy, and Eisenberg all hold senior positions in organizations such as the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, the United Jewish Appeal, UJA, a billion-dollar Zionist charity organization, and the New York-based Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Jewish Holocaust. Silverstein is a former chairman of UJA. This organization raises hundreds of millions of dollars every year for a network of Jewish agencies in the United States and Israel. Eisenberg, who was instrumental in obtaining the lease for Silverstein, is on the planning board of the UJA. Eisenberg, in his role with the Port Authority, was the key person who negotiated the 99-year leases for Silverstein and Frank Lowy's Westfield America, who were in fact the low bidders for the lease on the 110-story towers and the retail mall. 6 weeks before the World Trade Center towers were destroyed, the Port Authority, with the assistance of Jewish Chairman Eisenberg, completed the process of leasing them for 99 years to Larry Silverstein, the developer who had built 7 World Trade Center, which mysteriously self-demolished at 5:25 p.m. on 9/11, although the building wasn't hit by a plane. Simultaneously, the retail space underneath the complex was leased to Westfield America, the U.S. division of an Australian company that is one of the world's largest operators of shopping malls. Paula Goldberger wrote in The New Yorker, 20th May 2002. Czechoslovakian-born Israeli commando Frank Lowy, a former fighter in Israel's Golani Brigade, immigrated to Australia in the 1950s. Lowy leased the shopping concourse called the Mall at the World Trade Center, which comprised about 427,000 square feet of retail space. Today, Lowy and his 3 sons control Westfield Corporation, one of the largest operators of shopping centers in the United States and the world. Lowy is described by the Sydney Morning Herald as, quote, a self-made man with a strong interest in the Holocaust and Israeli politics, unquote. Dov Zakheim's SPC Corporation provided the flight termination system and command transmitter system. Some people have posited that the planes that flew into the towers were remote controlled. Although sounding like science fiction to the average person, this technology has existed for several decades. In an emergency situation in which pilot and co-pilot have been incapacitated, ground control can take control of a plane and fly it safe and sound to its destination. The argument for the use of this technology would be to say that to ensure that the planes met their targets, instead of relying on some supposed suicide hijackers who might bail out at the last minute, remote control technology was used. We are not here to argue for this point, point nor disagree with it, but it is more than telling that System Planning Corporation, or SPC, designs, manufactures, and distributes highly sophisticated technology that enables an operator to fly by remote control as many as 8 different airborne vehicles at the same time from one position, either on the ground or airborne. System Planning Corporation markets the technology to take over the controls of an airborne vehicle already in flight. For example, the flight termination system technology could hijack hijackers and bring the plane down safely. The flight termination system can be used in conjunction with the CTS technology that can control up to 8 airborne vehicles simultaneously. The possibility of nefarious use of these brilliant technologies developed and deployed by Systems Planning Corporation certainly deserves careful consideration in any full and impartial investigation of what actually took place on 9/11. In the context of 9/11, it also needs to be pointed out that Rabbi Dov Zakheim was Chief Executive Officer of System Planning Corporation's International Division until President George W. Bush appointed him Undersecretary of Defense and Comptroller of the Pentagon. Not long before Rabbi Zakheim rose to power over the Pentagon's labyrinthine, bottomless accounts, he co-authored an article entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, which was published by the Project for a New American Century in September 2000, exactly a year before 9/11. In this article, on page 51, it is stated that, quote, "The process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor," unquote. Larry Silverstein, a key figure in the Jewish crime network, dual Israeli citizen and World Trade Center leaseholder, who pocketed $4 billion for the attacks of 9/11. Somehow Silverstein had the mysterious foresight to insure both of the towers with an insurance policy specifically covering acts of terrorism just weeks before September 11th, 2001. But things get more absurd than this. Enter P-Tech. The Israeli Mossad also had their hands in the most sensitive computer networks in the U.S. government through a little-known firm called P-Tech. 9/11 was also a computer crime. America's security apparatus and infrastructure would have reacted to the hijacking, then scrambled fighter jets, and would have eliminated the threats to thousands of Americans. Unfortunately, most of the critical computer systems were run by P-Tech. This left gaping holes in the communication networks and interoperability between the computer systems, which would allow a hijacker to cause severe miscommunication and delay any reaction to the real-time hijacking. Keep in mind, there were drills going on of flights crashing into buildings on 9/11, as well as other drills, such as Operation Northern Vigilance, Operation Vigilant Guardian, Operation Northern Guardian, and Operation Vigilant Warrior. Joe Bergantino, a reporter for WBZ-TV's investigative team, was torn. He could risk breaking a story based on months of work investigating a software firm linked to terrorism, or heed the government's demand to hold the story for national security reasons. In mid-June, Bergantino received a tip from a woman in New York who suspected that P-Tech, a computer software company in Quincy, Massachusetts, had ties to terrorists. P-Tech specialized in developing software that manages information contained in computer networks. Bergantino's investigation revealed that P-Tech's clients included many federal government agencies, including the U.S. Army, the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Naval Air Command, Congress, the Department of Energy, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA, and the Internal Revenue Service, as well as NATO and the Federal Bureau of Investigation and moreover, the Secret Service and even the White House. On the surface, it seemed P-TECH can be linked to Saudis and Arabs, as they are the frontmen financiers of P-TECH. This is not dissimilar to the pattern, as the deceptive alternative media has also linked the official story's antagonists as night teen hijackers from Saudi Arabia. However, this is another clever smokescreen. Recall our mention of the word Sayanim, which means a Jewish informant or helper. Michael Goff, a criminal Jew who comes from a long line of B'nai B'rith Freemasons, left a very cushy job with the law firm of Cedar and Chandler to work for Arabs and run marketing for an unknown software company. Michael Goff was marketing manager at P-TECH Incorporated, a leading provider of business process modeling, design, and development software. In this capacity, Michael managed various marketing programs and activities, including public relations, direct mail, web development, collateral, trade shows, and seminars. Additionally, Michael worked closely with the P-TECH sales organization to perform competitive analysis as well as manage lead tracking and fulfillment activities. Goff also worked for an Israeli-run computer security company called Guardium. Guardium is a database security firm, clearly a Mossad operation working in a critical area, the same area that the two planes that hit the World Trade Center originated, Boston's Logan Airport. The three firms that finance Guardium are all Israeli and all manned by Mossad agents. It should be noted that Mossad's headquarters is in Herzliya. It is clear that the three firms, Cedar Fund, Veritas Venture Partners, and Stage One, are all Mossad funding outfits. So with P-TECH, what we had was an American Sayan, i.e. a Jewish agent who works with the Mossad when necessary, Michael S. Goff, who had Mossad agents feeding him information and directing him while he worked with his Lebanese Muslim partners in P-TECH. Now, why would a young American lawyer working with a good law firm in his hometown suddenly leave the practice of law and work with a dodgy startup software company owned and financed by a Lebanese and a Saudi? Goff's family is a well-respected and well-known family in Worcester, Massachusetts. After law school, he had it made at the law firm. Why the sudden career change? It is clear that Goff is one of several 100,000 Sayanim, and he was tapped by Mossad to do a quick career change for the good of the Jewish people and Israel, of course. Under Goff, P-TECH software loaded with trapdoors and Trojan horses was sold and loaded onto the most sensitive computer systems, which subsequently failed miserably, or performed well, depending on your view, on September 11th, 2001. Goff's father and grandfather, Samuel, were accountants who belonged to Worcester's Commonwealth Lodge 600 of B'nai B'rith. They were both 32nd degree Masons. But P-TECH wasn't the only software firm that was involved with the massive breakdown in communication on 9/11. Because the attacks involved systems used by the FAA, NORAD, and the U.S. Air Force, the conspirators would have needed super user access to the command and control centers of these three separate organizations. One such company is MITRE Corporation. Indira Singh, an IT consultant who previously worked on a Defense Advanced Research Project, or DARPA project, and who was employed by J.P. Morgan on 9/11 in risk management, pointed to MITRE's role at the FAA during the 9/11 Citizens Commission hearings in New York in September 2004. Quote, P-TECH was with the MITRE Corporation in the basement of the FAA for 2 years prior to 9/11, Singh said. Quote, their specific job is to look at interoperability issues the FAA had with NORAD and the Air Force in the case of an emergency. If anyone was in a position to know that the FAA, that there was a window of opportunity or to insert software or to change anything, it would have been P-TECH along with MITRE. Unquote. The MITRE Corporation is a major defense contracting organization headed by the former Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI, which was none other than Jew Dr. James Rodney Schlesinger. Schlesinger, who was reportedly made DCI at the request of Henry Kissinger in 1973, later served as Secretary of Defense. Schlesinger, a former Director of Strategic Studies at the RAND Corporation, was described in a 1973 biography as a devout Lutheran, although he was born in New York in 1929 to immigrant Jewish parents from Austria and Russia. Schlesinger earned 3 degrees from Harvard University. Schlesinger's father, an accountant, founded the accounting firm Schlesinger and Haas and was a trustee and chairman of the budget of the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. His father was also a member of the New York State Grand Lodge of Masons. On 17th October 2001, Michelle Moad reported in the Mercury of Philadelphia that 2 men were caught by federal immigration authorities with detailed footage of the Sears Tower in Chicago, Illinois. The authorities described them as Middle Eastern men. Police arrived on the scene due to a call from Pizzeria Uno, a restaurant whose manager reported that the men had a tractor trailer and were dumping something described as a pile of furniture at the rear of the pizzeria. Of the 2 men, one identified himself as Moshe Almakias, age 30. This person fled the scene, according to police. The manager of the restaurant reported to the officers that the vehicle read Moving Systems Incorporated and included a phone number. The Middle Eastern man, later identified as Ron Qatar, age 23, exited the vehicle and said that the operator, 30-year-old Moshe Almakias, was across the street. He was spotted with a Jewish female, Eilert Reisler, age 23, across the street, but she soon began to walk in the opposite direction of Almakias as soon as she was spotted by the police. When Reisler was apprehended, searched, and questioned, she was found to have a German passport in her name and medication in another. Getting back to Almakias, he stated that he didn't dump any furniture behind the restaurant and that he was on his way to a customer in New York. He was unable to provide either an address or phone number for the customer. When an arriving officer examined the vehicle, it was found to be in numerous violations and even not in safe working order and was subsequently put out of commission. The truck was, in fact, loaded to 3/4 capacity with household items, boxes, and furniture. Officer Gerald Swartz of the Whitpain Police Department found a video camera amongst the load. Plymouth police officer David McCann reviewed the tape and found that it had footage of Chicago, but suspiciously had numerous zoom-in shots of the Sears Tower. The 3 suspects were eventually questioned by the FBI and detained by INS. The Israelis were eventually released, but coupled with the antics of the dancing Jews that were caught on 9/11 and their front company, Urban Moving Systems, and these suspicious characters and their supposed moving company, is it possible that the plane that went down in Pennsylvania was intended for the Sears Tower in Chicago before the aircraft made an abrupt change of course over the state of Ohio?
Israeli Mossad terrorist operations extend to numerous countries. Here is just one example apart from 9/11 and others that we have briefly covered. As reported in La Voz de Altasan, 2 men posing as press photographers, one of them a former Israeli colonel and Mossad agent, were arrested inside the Mexican Congress on October 10, 2001, armed with 9mm pistols, 9 grenades, explosives, 3 detonators, and 58 bullets, but were released following intense pressure from the Israeli embassy. The report stated, "We believe that the 2 Zionist terrorists were going to blow up the Mexican Congress. The second phase was to mobilize both the Mexican and U.S. press to blame Osama bin Laden. Most likely then Mexico would declare war on Afghanistan as well, commit troops and all the oil it could spare to combat Islamic terrorism." As reported in La Voz de Altasan, Los Angeles, Alta California. In a mind-blowing development, La Voz de Altasan has learned that the Mexican Army General Rafael Marcial Macedo de la Concha, who heads the Procuraduría General de la República, that's the Mexican Department of Justice, has released the retired Israeli Defense Force Colonel and presumed Mossad agent Salvador Gereksen Smeki, an Israeli illegal immigrant, Sar Ben-Zevi, after both had penetrated the security of the Mexican Congress and were in possession of guns, hand grenades, and explosives. This morning, La Voz de Altazan had a personal telephone interview with Mexican Congressional Press Secretary, Licenciada Adriana Lopez, and verified the arrest of two Israelis after they had entered through the highly secure front entrance of the Palacio Legislativo de San Larzo. She stated to La Voz de Altazan that the two terrorists had taken advantage of the situation that had occurred about 1700 hours of Wednesday, October 10th, when a large contingent of sugar industry unionists were entering through the metal detectors. The two Israelis followed about 50 of the unionists to the office of the President of Mexican Congress, Beatriz Paredes. The two Israelis were first pretending to be press photographers, but called attention to the sugar unionists because of their nervous and out-of-ordinary behavior. About 10 of the unionists confronted them and observed that they were carrying guns and what looked to them to be explosives. They held the two Israelis until official congressional security personnel took them into custody. The head of congressional security, Salvador Alarc, verified that the Israelis had in their possession 9 grenades, sticks of dynamite, detonators, wiring, and 2mm Glock automatics. Mexican Congressional Press Secretary Licenciada Adriana Lopez informed La Voz de Altazan in the telephone interview that congressional security then turned the terrorists Salvador Gereksen Smeki, age 34, and Sar Ben-Zevi, age 27, to the Procuraduría General de la República, Mexican Department of Justice, which is headed by Mexican Army General Rafael Marcial Mesado de la Concha. Initial reports by the Procuraduría General de la República, PGR, were that both Israelis worked for a private security agency and that they both had gun permits. It turned out that there was no connection to either suspect to any private security agency. The PGR has released the retired Israeli IDF colonel with the official explanation that he had a legal permit to carry a gun. They also released the illegal Israeli immigrant on about $4,000 bail and had the case turned over to the Mexican immigration authorities. Mexican Congressional Press Secretary Licenciada Adriana Lopez was surprised to hear from La Voz de Altazan of the release of the two Israelis. La Voz de Altazan has also learned that the Israeli embassy used heavy-handed measures to have the two Israelis released. Very high-level emergency meetings took place between Mexican Secretary of Foreign Relations Jorge Gutman, General Mesado de la Concha, and a top Ariel Sharon envoy who flew to Mexico City especially for that purpose. Elias Luff of the Israeli embassy worked night and day, and their official spokeswoman, Hilla Engelhardt, went into high gear after many hours of complete silence. What went on during those high-level meetings, no one knows, but many in Mexico are in disbelief at their release. Guns and any kind of explosive is highly illegal for Mexican citizens, and the fact that these two Israelis had them inside the Mexican Congress makes their release highly suspect. What is really going on? Jorge Gutman, the Mexican Foreign Secretary, has very strong Zionist connections and himself is of the Jewish descent. Mexican Army General Mesado de la Concha has strong connections to the U.S. military-industrial complex and through this to the Israeli Defense Forces. Have any of these connections influenced the decisions to release the two Zionists?
former Italian President Francisco Cossega, who revealed the existence of Operation Gladio, told Italy's oldest and most widely read newspaper that the 9/11 terrorist attacks were run by the Mossad, and that this was common knowledge among global intelligence agencies. In what translates awkwardly into English, Cossega told the newspaper Corriere della Sera, all the intelligence services of America and Europe know well that the disastrous attack has been planned and realized from the Mossad, with the aid of the Zionist world, in order to put into accusation the Arabic countries and in order to induce the Western powers to take part in Iraq and Afghanistan, unquote. The script for Missing Links was originally over 5 hours. Due to time constraints, many key individuals with established connections to 9/11 could not be examined. Here are a few ancillary pieces of evidence and information which you may research in greater detail on your own. It is possible that these will be exhaustively addressed in another film by the makers of Missing Links or by other investigators in the future. We encourage you to do your due diligence in investigation. Jack Abramoff. He entertained the supposed lead hijacker Mohammed Atta aboard his yacht. Keep in mind that the argument of this video is that personalities such as Atta were only used as misdirection. Such villains like Osama bin Laden are mere inventions of the Jewish crime network and are thus hardly worth mention, save for their direct connection to the Jews who planned, orchestrated, and benefited from 9/11. Isser Harel, a Polish Khazar Jew who founded Israel's Mossad. He ran Mossad from 1947 to 1963. He was director of Shin Bet from 1948 to 1952 and Haganah. In his career as a Jewish terrorist, he was also intimately involved in the JFK assassination. As a side note, the film which unashamedly shows the assassination of President John F. Kennedy was filmed by Abraham Zapruder. Zapruder is a Jew. The Zapruder film serves as a warning to anyone who would attempt to take on the Jewish mafia. It was absolutely no coincidence that a Jew happened to catch the assassination on video camera. But the topic of the Jewish hand in the JFK assassination is the subject for another film. Getting back to Isser Harel, it is extremely important to mention that Harel predicted in 1979 that the, quote, tallest building in New York City, unquote, would be hit by, quote unquote, terrorists because it was a phallic symbol. The fact that 9/11 was planned by the Jews through the admittance of Isser Harel is documented in a book by Michael Evans. Evans is a Jewish Khazar masquerading as a Christian. This is referred to as a crypto-Jew. Benjamin Netanyahu. When asked on 9/11 what the September 11th attack meant for U.S.-Israeli relations, Netanyahu plainly stated, "It's very good." He also wrote a book in the early 80s titled Terrorism: How the West Can Win. He was the Prime Minister of Israel to whom the Clean Break document, or ACB doc, was presented. Benjamin Chertoff. Benjamin is Michael Chertoff's cousin. This Jewish criminal personality is responsible for writing a hit piece debunking so-called 9/11 conspiracy theories. Benjamin wrote the article for Popular Mechanics. Ever wonder why even the most well-known 9/11 conspiracy movies never bothered to mention the Jewish crime network? We gently suggest that it's time to start questioning not only those who attempt to debunk 9/11 conspiracy theories, but also question the very people who put forth such theories, with nary a mention of the exhaustive facts we have detailed herein that have been readily available to any investigator. Ronald Lauder, a key Cyan, or Jewish criminal asset, cosmetics Estee Lauder magnate, he founded a school for the Mossad in Herzliya called the Lauder School for Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy. Ronald Lauder is also president of the Jewish National Fund and former chairman of New York Governor George Pataki's Commission on Privatization. He is the key individual who pushed the privatization of the World Trade Center and the former Stewart Air Force Base, where the flight paths of the two planes that hit the Twin Towers oddly converged. Ronald Lauder played a significant, albeit unreported, role in the preparation for 9/11. Amit Yoren, founder and director of Guardium. He went to West Point and became the manager of computer network security for the Pentagon and Secretary of Defense. Yoren went on to serve as the czar of cybersecurity for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which is run by criminal Jew Michael Chertoff. Stephen Kaufman, program leader for the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, cover-up of World Trade Center 7 crimes. Even after 7 years, NIST releases a report reaffirming the official fairy tale about the collapse of World Trade Center Building 7. Kroll Associates. Kroll Associates was responsible for revamping security at the World Trade Center after the 1993 terrorist bombing. Douglas France of the New York Times reported in 1994. This is a crucial point because those who controlled security at the World Trade Center are prime suspects in the demolition of the Twin Towers. The first plane struck directly into the computer room of Marsh, or Kroll USA, in the North Tower. Or rather, it was precision-guided on 9/11. Israeli Aerospace Industries, prime suspect for leasing possible flight termination systems, FTS technology-equipped airplanes to the airlines. IAI is ran by Shalom Yoren. Jerome Hauer, John O'Neill, the former chief of counterterrorism with the FBI, who had investigated al-Qaeda, was the head of security for the World Trade Center complex and was reportedly killed on his first day of work on 9/11. O'Neill had been appointed to this position by the managing director of the Kroll Security Company, Jerome M. Hauer. Kroll evidently continued to manage security for the World Trade Center complex from 1993 until 9/11. Prior to joining Kroll, Hauer, a Jew, had been the director of Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, or OEM, where he had been the driving force to have the OEM command bunker built into Larry Silverstein's 47-story World Trade Center Building 7, the tower which fell into its footprint at 5:21 p.m. on 9/11. Testimony from Larry Silverstein and physical evidence strongly suggest that World Trade Center Building 7 was demolished with explosives, specifically using a substance known as thermite. Where were our intelligence agencies before, on, and after 9/11? While there have been numerous analysts, operatives, and employees of the various U.S. investigative and espionage organizations who have come forward, it remains to be seen that the FBI, CIA, or other such groups have thwarted the Jewish criminal network. We must first understand who controls these organizations to understand their lack of commitment to America. Given the FBI and CIA's repeated ineptness and closing down of investigations into the Jewish crime network, it should be pretty clear who controls those two branches of our government. But what about the National Security Agency? On 4th November 1952, Harry Solomon Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, formed the National Security Agency, or NSA. The operational objective of the NSA is to secure and protect the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The NSA may break any law so long as their actions return to that single objective.
Los hoch. Hey, Aufstehen, hoch.
When it comes to secretive organizations such as the NSA, one can never be too sure what their objectives are, and if the total organization, or part of it, are controlled by anti-American elements. As outsiders, we can observe exterior evidence and hopefully reach some solid conclusions. On 16th June 2006, Christopher Boleyn, a reporter for the American Free Press, reported that the NSA has selected, as their encryption software, a program developed by RSA Security Encryption Software. RSA stands for the names of the founders of the firm: Ronald L. Rivest, Adi Shamir, and Leonard M. Edelman. Adi Shamir, the lead theoretician, is an Israeli citizen and a professor at the Weizmann Institute, a scientific institution tied to the Israeli defense establishment. On 3rd August 2006, as reported at Salon.com by Sidney Blumenthal, the NSA was apparently sharing signal intelligence to Israel to monitor whether Syria and Iran were supplying new armaments to Hezbollah, as it was firing hundreds hundreds of missiles into northern Israel. On 2nd February 2007, the ACLU added a video to their YouTube account which shows American Civil Liberties Union members attacking the NSA for domestic spying. ACLU is, of course, a Jewish-controlled organization, and of note, ACLU members in the video are Jewish.
Americans have no assurance today, and they will have no assurance tomorrow without an injunction that their phone calls and emails are safe from the prying eyes of the NSA.
On 30th October 2007, as reported by Wayne Madsen, who was formerly employed by the NSA, the organization is now threatened with possible infiltration by Israeli spies. Mr. Madsen notes that the National Security Agency was penetrated by Israeli contractors working for Israel's Mossad organization. This was done via programs initiated by the Reagan administration, which sought to involve Israel in NSA-related signals intelligence activities, Dindy and Pyrex. Madsen asserts that the NSA has always harbored skepticism about Israel, quoting him that due to, quote, the Israeli attack on the NSA signals intelligence ship, the USS Liberty, in 1967, it was an attack that is now considered by a majority of historians and intelligence experts to have been a deliberate attack aimed at blindsiding U.S. intelligence from war crimes being carried out by Israel in the Sinai Desert during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, unquote. Some questions remain. Why was the NSA supplying intelligence to Israel? Why is the Jewish-controlled ACLU preaching against the NSA? Why is the NSA still doing business with Israel when it is known that the USS Liberty was an NSA ship and it was Israel that intentionally attacked and killed 34 Americans on board and wounded over 170 others? Finally, why is Israel trying to infiltrate the NSA if they already seem to have such a close and favorable relationship?
Who are you guys?
If the intelligence world was a family, think of us as the uncle no one ever talks about.
In addition to the special thanks given at the introduction to this video, we also extend thanks to the New Jersey, New York, and Illinois police departments. Thank you for your service. A portion of the text that has been narrated for this video came from sources which are known to be double agents for the Jewish crime network. The research of such individuals is good, yet no credit will be given to these individuals in order to deny them any kind of promotion by the makers of this video. Trusted individuals that contributed to the production of this video may have their names cited at the website for this video. Thank you for